أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. We seek refuge in Allah from the accursed shaitan. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most merciful, especially merciful. Subhanaka, glory be to you, O Allah. La ilma lana, there is no knowledge for us. Illa ma 'allamtana, except that which you teach us. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una, O Allah, teach us that which will be beneficial for us. Wazidana ilma, and increase us in knowledge. Warzuqna fahma, and grant us understanding. Ya muqallib al-qulub, O change of hearts. ثبت قلوبنا على دينك, keep our hearts firm on your deen. Allahumma ja'al a'malana khalisatan liwajhik, O Allah, grant our actions to be done sincerely for your sake. ولا تجعل فيها حظا لغيرك, and let there not be in them a portion for other than you. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I greet you with a universal greeting of peace. My peace and blessings be upon you and upon all of us. I am Wasfia Al-Talib, and I am your facilitator of on behalf of Muslims Connected of this evening's session. Before I hand over to our presenter, just a few announcements of what is happening over at Muslims Connected at the moment. We will be hosting a conversational Arabic class, which will be starting on the 12th of October. Classes will take place on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings at 7:30 to 8:30 for 7 weeks. And it's open to both males and females. So if you are interested in learning conversational Arabic or brushing up on your Arabic, please do sign up for that course. And then next week, Sunday, at the same time, we will be hosting another webinar also on related to mental illness. It will actually cover an overview of mental illnesses, and including the myths and misconceptions in psychiatry, common psychiatric disorders, as well as the Islamic perspective. So be sure to be here, same time, same place next week, Sunday, for that webinar. So that's about it, I think. Just wanted to let you know as well that we do have a few spaces open for one-on-one Quran lessons, online Quran lessons for females. You can contact us regarding that as well. And we are always here for your questions and concerns and to serve you in whichever way we possibly can. This evening, we will be having a session on the importance of self-care, particularly during the pandemic that we are going through. And this will be presented by Nabeela Gangat, who completed her honors and master's degrees in educational psychology at the University of Witwatersrand. She is an educational psychologist who works in private practice in Johannesburg, South Africa. And we really look forward to today's topic on the importance of self-care. So I hand over to you, Nabeela.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you can hear me quite clearly. And let me start sharing my screen. I think you can see me and hear me quite clearly. That's perfect. Tonight, inshallah, I will be discussing the importance of self-care during COVID-19. I do think this topic is exceptionally important in the times that we're living in. And yeah, I think Wasfia did cover the welcome, so I'm just going to skip over that. She also introduced myself, shukran for that. I think the reason for this discussion is many families are struggling in terms of how to actually find a new normal when things are so abnormal. I will go through some of the key points that I think are valuable in terms of dealing with the current pandemic that we're living through. The overview of discussion, I will go through these 5 areas in detail. So the first one is, what is self-care? I think there are quite a few myths and also misconceptions around self-care, which I would like to clear up. the importance of routine, which I do think is very, very important in terms of grounding so that we are able to find a new normal when things seem very, very abnormal. Our anxiety, depression, and our mental health is definitely all over the place. How to achieve a healthy work-life balance, especially with regard to setting boundaries and healthy ways to then relieve stress. What is self-care? So several organizations and researchers take a health-oriented approach when defining self-care. The World Health Organization defines self-care as the ability of individuals, families, and communities to promote health, prevent disease, maintain health, and to cope with illness and disability with or without the support of a healthcare provider. According to this definition, self-care then includes everything related to staying physically healthy, including hygiene, nutrition, and seeking medical care when needed. It's all the steps an individual can take to manage stresses in his or her life and can take care of his or her own health and well-being. So what is self-care? Self-care is not synonymous with self-indulgence or being selfish. I hear many, many parents and individuals that I do come across with when I, for example, say, be gentle with yourself and please practice some self-care. They look at you weirdly and think that it's being quite selfish or being self-indulgent. Self-care means taking care of yourself so that you can be healthy, you can be well, you can do your job, you can help and care for others, and you can do all the things you need to and want to accomplish in a day. I do think it's exceptionally important that when our entire routine, especially during hard lockdown and the times where we had a very tough curfew in terms of hours when we could leave the house, what we were able to do, numbers in terms of socializing, I think this is where self-care is really, really important to take care of yourself. So if you think you've been hearing more about self-care now, you're actually right. One indicator which I always like to use is, according to Google Trends, the number of searches for self-care has more than doubled since 2015. And this does show that there is definitely a need for us to understand self-care, but people are also becoming more curious about what we need in order to take care of ourselves, which I do think is useful. So the need for self-care is obvious. We are living through a global pandemic. We also have an epidemic of anxiety and depression, and everybody feels it. I'm also really pleased to hear that next week that psychiatric illnesses in a general way with Muslims Connected will be dealt with, because I do think that education and knowledge needs to be shared in those particular areas as well. So what is self-care? So self-care is part of the answer to how we can all better cope with daily stresses. And these are normal, everyday, daily activities or activities of living, activities of daily living, as I like to call them, that sometimes stress us out. So it's life stress, work stress, and the stress of trying to keep up with the pace of daily life, which technology, unfortunately, has hastened more than ever. So if we were to think 15, even 10 years ago, I, for myself, we wouldn't have as much connectedness in terms of technology being so widely and easily available. And if, for example, we just think of email or the way that I'm actually sharing this information with you, I don't think we would even think that this would be possible on such a large scale. So people are definitely feeling lonelier and less able to unwind and slow down, which makes them feel more anxious and overwhelmed by even the simplest tasks. I like to use some of these things to sort of we call it like check your battery, or how are you currently feeling? And these things are important to just sort of check in with yourself, because very often we discard our feelings and emotions and we never really understand whether we're feeling good, we're feeling great, we're feeling okay, we're feeling meh, we're feeling empty. And this sort of battery will help you understand and make you more aware of where you're currently sitting in terms of your emotional and mental health. So self-care is a very multifaceted approach, and it's a very broad umbrella term. There's a few images that I will go through. So for example, and I will go through some of them in more detail, which I do think are more pertinent and important. For example, it's taking a step back. I think far too often in the lives that we kind of lead, we're very quick to jump into something quite quickly, and we never really take a step back to actually assess a situation. And this is in interpersonal relationships, in family relationships, in children-parent relationships, in work relationships, which I will cover. We don't often take a step back. We very generally hard on ourselves, so we don't easily forgive ourselves. It's an example of saying no when, for example, you're not supposed to feel guilty when you say no. For example, staying at home if you feel like you can't deal with something at work or at school for kids, setting boundaries, which I will go through in a lot of detail, asking for what you need, putting yourself first, spending time alone, asking for help. And these things can be all part of self-care, which we never really think about consciously. There's different types of self-care. There's physical self-care, emotional self-care, social self-care, spiritual self-care, personal self-care, the space that you sort of use or occupy, financial self-care, and in terms of your work, which is a huge part of COVID-19 and how it's changed the way we work, that's also a part of self-care. I will go through the main important areas and how we deal with these particular areas of self-care. If I can just go through some of these, if you think of physical self-care, that's usually quite an easy one that comes quite easily. So it's, for example, the kind of sleep, which I will go through, exercise, sleeping, nutrition, and obviously taking care of our physical bodies. The emotional self-care, it does seem to be catching on a little bit easier, but for example, how we manage stress, what kind of coping skills we have, and how you often deal with situations that, for example, provoke your anxiety or make your anxiety rise. These are important areas which we need to think about. Social self-care is quite interesting in that social media seems to connect. For example, Muslims Connected does occupy social media platforms, which can have a very positive, useful space. But when you think of the negative areas of social media, I do think that we need to be quite mindful in terms of how we occupy these spaces, how much we share, and in terms of whether we're putting ourselves out there. Because the moment you put yourself out there, you're open to judgment, criticism, and all of those lovely things that come into play. For kids especially, I don't think they think about the bullying, the cyberbullying in particular, and also how the critique and the critical voices can affect the way that they interact with social media, which is something they need to think about. Spiritual self-care is exceptionally important. And I do think that if, for example, we were to just think about our 5 salah and we were to not think of anything else in terms of a spiritual level, I do think the grounding of having that routine can be so valuable and so important. Your personal and your space of self-care, even financial and work, I will go through when I go through especially the balance, the work-life balance part. So self-care during a crisis, if we were to think of how many families have been affected during COVID-19 in different ways and areas, I do think that this kind of thing, especially these 6 simple things, you need to think about quite easily. So the meditation part, I would say we need to think of dhikr and salah, staying active, avoiding news. Initially, during the hard lockdown, we were constantly on Google trying to see what were the current COVID numbers, what were the trends. And I do think that that could just make our anxiety rise and wasn't a positive way to influence us on any level. The avoid people pleasing, I will have a special slide specifically for that, because I do think, especially during COVID-19, being at home, we have really struggled in terms of where the boundaries lie. And often we get caught in a trap of people pleasing, which I will talk about. Talking to loved ones always works. This is something that, especially in time of a crisis, when, for example, a loved one is hospitalized with COVID-19 or has passed away, you need to find some sort of grounding with people that you know. Talking to loved ones is a huge part of dealing with that. The thinking realistically and not panicking is also quite important, which I will discuss in terms of thought patterns. These are just some ideas in terms of what can also be self-care. And these can be personalized to exactly what you like or what kind of hobbies you have. I often think that people who are at home, especially when we were forced to be at home because of hard lockdown or strict hours of curfew, we really didn't understand what we enjoyed or what we liked because we were so busy in filling our lives with school or filling our lives with work when it came to adults, that it was very hard when you had a couple more minutes at home or a couple more days at home. You actually didn't know what you enjoyed or what you liked. And these are just some ideas that you can use in terms of dealing with managing self-care, especially when we were at home. Routine. The importance of routine is the second area that I really want to talk about. Because you are at home, our routine seems to fly completely out the window and we really don't seem to pay much attention. Routine is one of those areas that helps ground us and anchor us in a way that we often don't think about. So routine helps to promote positive self-care habits. Routine also encourages that the self-care parts that we previously spoke about fit in more easily. Often I hear parents tell me, especially when I see kids, but I don't have time. If you fit it as part of your life, as part of your routine or your ritual in the morning, in the evening before bed, I do think that you will find the time because it's part of something that you do every day. Routines also help us to create positive daily habits that promote self-care. And I think this is also something that we don't easily see the link. So we can then organize our time around things that we deem important to maintain happiness and feelings of fulfillment. I find that often because of the cycle of, especially when we were in hard lockdown and when we had tough curfew and strict curfew, it was interesting how we didn't have a lot of new memories. And often, even for myself, I find things to be quite blurry. So there isn't a clear sort of memory or new memory being formed because we sort of were on this hamster wheel doing the same thing day in and day out. Although I think if I were, even for example, to have included more self-care in those days, I think my memories would have been slightly more clearer and I would then have more feeling of fulfillment and not feeling like I'm forced to be at home. I would turn that around and I'm grateful to have a home, to actually have a home to be in. Routine provides comfort, and this is especially important for families with young kids or teenagers who are not coping very well because they have a lot of mental health issues. So this comfort allows us to feel like we are in control, even though we may have very little control. So for example, during hard lockdown, we had no control of where we could go, but it feels like we have control with a routine. This is especially important for children, especially as their entire routine and structure around school was changed exceptionally quickly, and they didn't really have a lot of time to adjust. And I think this was important, where a home routine that you establish quite easily and early on was something important. So your daily routine influences your quality of rest. So your sleep schedule and bedtime habits affect your mental sharpness, performance, emotional well-being, and energy level. So it is best if you can maintain a consistent time for waking and going to bed. So better mental health is a result of just a little extra planning when it comes to sleeping, for example, which I will spend quite a lot of time going through, because I think it's one of the main areas that many adults and teenagers and kids that I see struggle with. So if you, for example, think of a morning routine, a simple example of these, I use an example of a lady. If you were to wake up in the morning, have a glass of lemon water, do some yoga, have some oats for breakfast, have a shower, do some beauty rituals, whatever that may look like, and maybe do some planning for the day. This can be quite a comforting sense of control that you have because of what you plan to do for yourself. And this is entirely in your control. So your circadian rhythm is your sleep cycle, and this is critical for maintaining a healthy routine, which is something that was one of the first things that I personally struggle with, but I also think that many other families and people and adults and children that I see struggled with. So there are many processes that occur when we sleep that are critical for our body's optimal functioning, which cannot take place at any other time except when we sleep. I think it is exceptionally important that we pay attention to our circadian rhythm and spend a good couple of minutes thinking about this carefully and understanding why a good sleep cycle is important. Many people who have depression or have lots of other mental health issues, and especially teens, struggle with a healthy sleep routine, which I will explain why teenage sleep routine is very different to adults. So this is an example of a circadian rhythm in terms of using a clock, a 24-hour clock. If you start, for example, at 6 a.m., at 6:45 a.m., we have the sharpest blood pressure rise, which is an indication that you are meant to wake up around that time. Remember, 6 a.m. also is assuming closest time to sunrise, in fact. Your melatonin secretion stops, and I will spend some time talking about melatonin and what its function is. So melatonin is one of those really, really special neurotransmitters. It's a non-visual photoreceptic neurotransmitter that is responsible for the synchronization of the sleep-wake cycle. And Allah's Qudrat and amazing way that He designed us is it's specifically related to the light-dark in terms of the sunrise and sunset. So our bodies are actually geared towards working with sunrise and sunset, and that's related to melatonin. Our highest alertness is around 10 o'clock in the morning, and that's when we're most productive mentally. Then comes noon, midday, 2:30 best coordination, 3:30 fastest reaction time in terms of being able to react where our bodies are at their peak. Greatest cardiovascular efficiency and muscle strength, which is possibly maybe a good time for some people to exercise, maybe not too vigorous. Closer to bedtime, it becomes harder to sleep. At around 6 p.m., that's we're hitting towards sunset time, give or take, depending on where in the world you live. 6:30 p.m., highest blood pressure again. You then have your highest body temperature at around 7 o'clock, and your melatonin secretion starts for normal adults at around 9 o'clock, which is where the bedtime sort of cycle fits in. That's just one example. I'll go through a few. This is a different example in terms of a sleep-wake cycle, but it also includes the fasting, which I think is incredibly important in terms of feeding and fasting. The way that Allah designed our bodies is incredible, that as we feed during our waking hours, there's different processes in our bodies that take place that are very different to what happens when we're sleeping and we're actually fasting. And these are different productions. So you'll see that on the yellow part on the left-hand side of your screen, there's different sleep fasting processes that are included in terms of your liver, your pancreas, your fat, and your muscle. And during your feed and waking cycle, there's different processes that happen. I'm not going to go through the medical part of it, although I use this as an example because I think it's incredibly important that we keep a regular routine so that our bodies also process our bodily functions in a regular fashion, which would then contribute to us feeling healthier overall. I think it's very similar in the rest of it. And there's nothing really, except the one that I wanted to point out for ladies here especially, is that as soon as your melatonin secretion starts closer to sunset time, that's also when a lot of women complain about menopausal hot flushes or flushes at their worst. And I then understand how their sleep cycle can then be affected, which is really, really difficult to then manage. This is another example. In this example, I want to point out the brain processes and the neurotransmitters. So it's the middle section, the blue section of the brain. So if we think of melatonin, which I spoke to before, it's obviously a neurotransmitter that's primarily responsible for our sleep cycle. And there's examples of how I want to explain why melatonin is so important, because as we were sitting at home, our entire routine fell out of sync, but that also meant that our sleep cycle suffered. That also meant that we weren't feeling so good. And I think it all anchors down and comes down to not sleeping properly and not having that as a good routine. If you look at the SCN, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is part of our central nervous system, which is part of our brain. And this is where I say light affects it. So as I'm sitting here on my laptop is now transmitting blue light towards my eyes. My eyes are then interpreting that as bright light. And that could interrupt, for example, my melatonin that's being released, which means that I might take longer to fall asleep as I want to sleep this evening. What this means is, as we were sitting at home and working or watching TV or sitting on our phones, the blue light actually affected the way that our bodies are now releasing melatonin naturally, and therefore we struggle to sleep. And that's where people, for example, struggle with insomnia, and there's a whole host of issues that follow on from that. What this means is our eyes are primarily responsible for how we interpret light and how we then process light that's being filtered in front of us. So if we think of, for example, the RHT and then the MCGRC, which I will explain. So the RHT is a retinohypothalamic tract, which is where the optic nerve travels along in order to process light. And this is also primarily responsible for how we then, our bodies are now, so we are actually meant to be I was meant to be in a darker space, or with less light and blue light coming directly towards me in order for my melatonin secretion to be most effective, even though it isn't yet 9 o'clock, in terms of falling asleep easily. And this is where it's exceptionally important that we have clear boundaries in terms of screen time as adults. And I know we use this for kids, but I think for adults, we struggle with boundaries as well, where we don't have good boundaries in terms of how much we look at our phones, how much we look at our computers, when do we start working, when do we stop working. And this has all directly affected the way that we actually fall off to sleep and how easily we fall off to sleep. There are many, many factors that could disrupt a circadian rhythm. I just use these as an example. So there's extrinsic factors, for example, shift work or chronic jet lag when you, for example, travel and you go through different time zones. Metabolic or cardiovascular disease like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. All of these illnesses and sicknesses can actually affect the way our body releases melatonin and what our sleep quality is like. Neurological and psychological disease is directly affected by depression, poor sleep quality, as well as Alzheimer's disease because of the damage in the brain. Intrinsic factors is clock gene mutations and aging. As we get older, we do need less sleep, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a good sleep cycle that's very regular. The clock gene mutations are interesting. There are just certain people that don't need as much sleep as other people, and they function quite well. This depends on the individual, although I do think these people fall very far off on the normal sort of graph of where most people fall, but most people need between 7 to 8 hours of good sleep quality, depending on how you actually sleep. One of the most important parts of having a good circadian rhythm is to ensure that you don't lay awake in bed for longer than 15 minutes if you haven't fallen asleep. What this teaches your brain to do is that I'm going to lay in this bed awake. That means my bed is not actually meant for sleeping. My bed is meant to be awake. I always use the analogy that we never sit at a dining room table waiting to get hungry. We always go to the dining room table when we are hungry because we're ready to eat. It's interesting how many people will lay awake in their beds waiting to fall asleep and get tired, but it doesn't make sense, because that means that we're now laying awake in bed, teaching our brains that a bed is okay to lay awake in, which we then don't fall asleep in easily in. And this cycle needs to really stop, especially when we're at home and we have lots more time that we spend at home. I did say that I'm going to speak about the average teen circadian cycle, which is very different to a normal adult, well-adjusted adult cycle. The most important part of a teen sleep cycle, and this is where parents get super, super upset, and they're like, my teenager likes to stay up really late and sleep really late, but this doesn't work because school starts at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock and they just can't be ready and they're so sleepy and there's huge arguments and who knows what the morning looks like. Is melatonin for a teenager is naturally released an hour later compared to adults at 10 o'clock. But with the extended use of electronic devices, it seems like the sleep cycle for teenagers and the melatonin release is even getting pushed closer to 11 and 12 o'clock. What that means is there is definitely no good sleep that a teenager is getting because their bedtime is being pushed later and later. Their natural release of melatonin is something that many parents don't really consider or even think about, but this is exceptionally important. It's interesting how when teenagers wake up early in the morning, they do not have the same kind of energy as adults. And this is where their internal clock is literally they geared towards waking up early between or being feeling fully awake rather at about 9 o'clock. Unfortunately, the world didn't cater for teenagers, and work and school starts a lot earlier than 9 o'clock. And that means for that first hour or 2 hours before your teenager wakes up fully, things could be a bit blurry. So do not share with them important information. Do not overwhelm them and overburden them with things that need to be done in a certain way, because they will not be fully alert and be able to even comprehend exactly what you're asking them to do or telling them. The energy rise is generally from 10 o'clock to about 1 o'clock, which is okay because we do catch a lot of school in that time, and that's super important. But also with teenagers, they generally do have an afternoon slump, and that afternoon slump is something that's critical in terms of them not feeling 100%. And between 1 and 3, that's where they possibly like to have a nap or have a lay down, which is something that's very, very interesting. In terms of trying to develop a healthy sleep routine, so how do we actually develop a healthy sleep routine? Is you need to wake up and sort of sleep at a similar time. So the easiest thing to do is to set aside a time and think about in your life or in your sort of home. By 9 o'clock, all devices are away because that's when melatonin is released. We know that the blue light from a TV, a laptop, any electronic device that's not natural. The only one that I found recently that doesn't emit blue light is a Kindle, and a Kindle doesn't have that backlight that emits that blue light, which is probably the only device I can think of. Many parents ask me, or actually reading from an actual book with pages, not off a screen, that could possibly help in terms of releasing your melatonin, but not disrupting your sleep cycle. So wake up, sleeping at a similar time. Set aside a time that if you, by 9 o'clock, all devices are off, need to be in bed by 9:30. Remember the 15-minute rule. By about 9:45, if you're not asleep, you need to wake up and obviously walk around or do something else and not lay in bed awake, because you're teaching your body to be awake in bed. Obviously, maintaining a healthy diet is important, working out on a regular basis and exercising. Remember, if you do not spend your energy in your body, so your body is like a machine or like filled with energy. If you don't actually use that energy up effectively, you will not feel sleepy. If you don't feel sleepy, you will not be able to sleep. If you lay awake in bed not feeling sleepy, you then repeat this entire vicious cycle, which then affects your entire life. Limiting, obviously, caffeinated beverages. Keep your bed a sleep-only zone. This is exactly what I spoke about. Do not lay awake in bed. Laying awake, teaching yourself that your bed is actually a good space to now watch TV, or, for example, lay awake and stay awake for hours in bed, because you're then teaching yourself to be awake in bed. Create a peaceful bedroom, so soft lighting, not harsh lighting, nice smelly lavender sort of candles, or lavender, fresh lavender, or a scent that you like, something that's just calming. Watch your nighttime eating. Remember, if you have a very heavy meal at the nighttime, you're not going to be able to obviously fall asleep easily. Power down electronics, like I said, because of the blue light that's emitted from all these electronic devices, it then obviously affects your sleep cycle. And to obviously have a calm down. So I always like to call it like a buffer. So power down your electronics, switch off the TV, put your phone away, put your phone on charge, switch off your laptop, stop working. Maybe then you can have a cup of tea, non-caffeinated tea, a chamomile tea, caffeine-free rooibos tea, or whatever that your body can handle, even a warm cup of milk. And that's like a buffer that we have between the devices and bed. That's almost like a ritual that you fit in there, which also contributes to self-care in a very definite way. And the next or the last thing is to make sure that when your alarm goes off in the morning, as you're learning to form a sleep cycle, is do not hit snooze. You wake up, you literally sit up in bed and get out of bed. And once you awake, you awake. You're then teaching yourself that this is your sleep cycle and your routine. And I promise you, after you do this for about 6 to 8 weeks, which is how long it takes to reset your circadian rhythm, you will automatically wake up before your alarm goes off. And many, many people have said this to me. It does work, where you then automatically wake up before your alarm goes off, which would then contribute to a healthy sleep routine. The next part that I'm going to spend some time talking about is how to achieve a healthy work-leisure balance. I find this to be the most difficult part that many people are struggling with. And it's incredibly difficult to achieve an optimal work-life balance when we live at work. So I use that analogy because at the moment, especially when lots of people in corporate organizations are asking people to work from home, you're basically living at work. So many people then struggle to set clear boundaries in terms of time, space, and tasks that they need to complete during a workday because everything seems to be muddled and enmeshed and there aren't clear boundaries. I'll talk about setting boundaries in the next section. Family life has also been severely impacted due to the lack of balance, which has caused additional stress in marriages, family relationship, as well as children's lives. So the work-life balance and tips during COVID-19 is to set office hours, even if you are working from home, especially if you're working from home. To schedule breaks, to get outside safely, and to video call when possible. These are obviously when, for example, you're not allowed to leave the house or you're feeling quite sick or you're doing a self-quarantine because you have been exposed, those kind of things. So it's quite a hard sort of set of rules. If, for example, you are stuck in a certain room or area, self-quarantining because you might either have COVID, you might be recovering from COVID, or you might have had a contact with a COVID positive person. Tips to maintain a work-life balance during work from home, which is what the WFH stands for, is to separate work and living spaces. I find this to be incredibly important in that the first thing you need to do is to design a home office space to be productive. So you're not working in your dining room table or on your kitchen table, but set aside a specific space, even if it is your dining room table, that is a special set space that you work from only, but you do not eat at the same space. Make sure that you obviously schedule lunch breaks and schedule meal breaks in between. And I would advise that you don't sit at the same workspace eating because now there's a muddle. There's a workspace and there's an eating space and you're overlapping. Eat at an eating space and work at a workspace. Plan post-work activities, and this will obviously keep you invigorated and excited to make you feel that you actually have some leisure time to set aside. Set a work from home schedule. Remind yourself the time that you are on work and the time that you are off work, because the most important part of working from home is productivity has increased, which I will share the numbers with you, but that's at risk of what? We have sacrificed so much by working from home that we can't actually fix or replace any of these things. And avoid sitting at your workspace on days off or on time off, meaning that you're not actually now relaxing in your workspace and you're not working in your relaxing space, which is a huge problem as well. The impact of COVID-19 on overall well-being, I find these stats to be incredibly alarming, is that the pandemic negatively affected quality of life by 42%. If you think of that, is that every single person's life has been affected negatively in some way, and that 42% is a large number. 33% of people report that they have a poorer work-life balance, meaning they find it incredibly hard to understand when they're on work and when they're off work. 15% experience distress based on the Resident Wellbeing Index. So these are stats from, I think it's the UK and America or somewhere, I'm not entirely sure, but basically the Wellbeing Index, and I'll show you how we rank as South Africans, is that there's been a huge dip in terms of how people think they are doing. So these are all very subjective, sort of asking a person, do you feel like you're coping with work life? No. Do you feel like you have good well-being? No. And that 15% reported, which is also quite a large number of people reporting that they don't feel good because of COVID-19, and this is related to overall well-being, which then directly contributes to all the psychological issues that we are all seeing around us in terms of anxiety, depression, and all the rise in mental health issues, which is extraordinary at the moment. So the work from home COVID-19 metrics, these are quite important stats, and I will spend some time talking about this, is that there has been an increase in 23% of total meetings that people have attended because in the usual going into the workplace kind of setting, people then used to talk to each other and they didn't really need to set up a meeting. But because everyone's now so isolated, guess what? We need to set up a meeting to just talk to someone. And that's seen an almost a 23% rise, or definitely a 23% rise in terms of total meetings that we attend. Focus time is dropped by 29%, meaning that we're less focused, but we're trying to do more work. There's also been a 23% rise in after hours email, because remember, we're living at work. We're not living at home, we're living at work. There's been a 27% decrease in work activity because we're not feeling productive and therefore we can't do anything. There's been a 14% size in meeting size, a drop, which isn't a bad thing because there have been more one-on-one meetings because meetings are not as large as they possibly used to. There's been a 34% rise in interruptions, and these are the usual ones. I mean, they're quite funny ones, some of them, where kids are just storming into Zoom meetings because there's no boundaries. And these are where we need to work very hard, especially working from home, in terms of this, reducing interruptions. The next one is very alarming, is that there's been a 34% rise in workday length. So if we normally work from 8 to 4, guess what? We're working for a 34% extra, which when I worked out adds up to almost about 2 hours extra time. So your 8-hour workday is now turning into a 10-hour workday. And if you think of what you would normally do with those 2 hours, you're sacrificing your children, you're sacrificing your family, you're sacrificing your relationships, you're sacrificing your hobby, you're sacrificing your health. And there's a whole other list of things that are also being sacrificed along the way, which you obviously cannot get back, which is incredibly important to now understand why boundaries are so important. The possible only good part of this entire graph is that manager responsiveness has improved by 34%. And I'm not sure how that really affects your mental health, but maybe if your manager is more responsive, you can maybe try and get something done quicker if, for example, something is approved. But that also means that your manager is now working longer hours. There's obviously after hours email and all of that in order to get to your response, for example, quite quickly, which isn't necessarily a good thing. The countries with the worst work-life balance, you'll see that we rank, if it's from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, we rank 6th from the bottom. So we're sort of in the middle, and you'll see the other countries there are obviously the most, lots of first world countries there as well. They work very, very hard. But South Africa has one of the worst work-life balances. And these are numbers from 2017. I couldn't find more detailed, more recent numbers, but I imagine that they're either similar or worse. I don't think they could be better. And this shows that South Africans obviously are valued all over the world for their work ethic, but that means we sacrifice a lot because we don't have good work-life balance. And this is incredibly important to try understand that we need to work on this as one of our really, really weak spots. If you think of the work-life balance equilibrium, I want to go through some of this. So there's 4 different quadrants that we can think about. So you can have someone with high well-being and high boundary control, and this is a person with in the green square. So this is the optimum sort of person that we're aiming for. You then get a person with low boundary control and high well-being, but these people are not great because their low boundary control means they might take on too much, but they have good well-being, meaning they cope well under pressure. But this means that they can only do that for a select time, and they are then sacrificing a couple of things in the process, which could drop them to the light orange or the dark red block. If you look at the dark red block, this is a block where we don't want to be. A person with high boundary control and low well-being, because of their boundaries that are so high, they might just say no to everything, and then they don't have good well-being and they feel really guilty about it. Or a person with high boundary control and low well-being, meaning they just also don't feel so good generally. And these are where you need to think of how you either take on tasks at work or how much of time you have to do something properly. And these things obviously will depend on the kind of work you do, which I obviously don't have time to go through all the different types of work that people do from home, but you need to think about your well-being, your high and low boundary control, and everything else that's also included in that. So 5 steps to creating productive work boundaries. Step 1, you need to choose boundaries over barriers. So barriers are about avoiding problems by walling off communication. Boundaries are for making responsibilities and agreements clear. So this is specifically for work. Figure out how you do your own best work first. So boundaries should help you take more control and therefore more responsibility. So you first need to know what you need in order to do something, especially when it comes to work-related project or some sort of work-related matter. You need to put yourself in your teammates' shoes. For people to respect your boundaries, they must know that you understand what they're up against and that you care about them. So this is where empathy comes in to be super, super important. You need to also make agreements in terms of the team's greater good. This is where setting healthy boundaries is not about defending yourself. It's about making the if-then agreements then smooth the path for your collective success as a team or as a group. You need to give based on long-term benefit and not short-term fears. So the most easy one is it's easiest to set and stick to boundaries when you frame them in terms of the big picture. I will go through boundaries next in quite a lot of detail. So setting boundaries. This is especially important when we do not have a regular routine with work and family. So many people struggle most with this aspect during COVID-19, when we were forced to be at home almost all day during hard lockdown, or when we had very strict rules and regulations in terms of leaving the home, or when kids were not allowed to be at school physically. So setting boundaries is a healthy way to ensure that you do not overextend yourself, you do not overcommit, you do not underdeliver, you do not feel guilty, you do not feel resentful, angry, and or disappointed, which I will go through in terms of how you set up those boundaries. Most important to remember is healthy boundaries help you to care for yourself, be generous with others, have healthier relationships, know your own limitations, ask for help when you need it, use your time well, and feel more relaxed, which is extremely important when it comes to helping set boundaries. The benefits of setting healthy boundaries are numerous, and I'll explain to you how you set boundaries and why you need to set boundaries. It allows you to have more compassion, you have greater assertiveness, your needs are met, there's less anger and resentment, you have a feeling of peace and safety, you have time and energy to do things that nourish and bring joy to your body, mind, and spirit. You feel respected by yourself and others. There's less conflict in relationships, improved communication, greater self-esteem, less anxiety and stress. You have increased confidence, and you then feel understood and accepted by friends and family. The benefits of, the benefits of setting boundaries. So the most important one here is it reduces your stress and mental load. Very, very important. It helps teach your children, if you have them, to set boundaries themselves, helps define your work life versus your home life, and establishes relationships that are emotionally healthy on all sides. So 7 tips for setting healthy boundaries. How do you set boundaries? Number 1, you need to start your day with limit setting intentions, meaning know from your start of your day what you are capable of taking on. Are you capable of ensuring that the entire neighborhood's children are, for example, taken to school and fetched from school? No. So you don't commit to something like that. You then ensure that your kids are taken to school and you ensure that your kids are brought back home, for example. Number 2, acknowledge what you gain by setting boundaries. This allows you to recenter and remain committed even when things get tough. If you commit to something, you deliver. If you commit to something and you don't deliver, you then feel very guilty, angry, resentful, and this then gets filtered out to all the people that are around you. Number 3, define your priorities. What are your priorities? Get clear on what you need, what you want, and what would be nice to have. And be very clear in terms of what this means, especially when you're stuck at home or you have COVID or you have someone who's positive and you can't necessarily just hop outside and do something that you would normally do. Number 4, communicate directly, clearly, and often. Telling people about your boundaries is your responsibility. You must make sure that you, for example, tell your spouse, I'm unable to do a shop today because unfortunately I have a very full day at work and we make another plan. And therefore there isn't the silent expectation that, oh no, I will get the groceries because usually I'm the one that does it. No, unfortunately my day today is really busy. I cannot do a shop. Can you please make a plan? Can you assist me? Or something along those lines. Number 5, you need to pay attention to your needs. So feelings of discomfort, overwhelming, or resentment are often indicators that we overreached a boundary, meaning we either overcommitted or underdelivered, or undercommitted and underdelivered, or overdelivered, for example. And it both ways can happen. You need to think about this. Number 6, you need to start with very small adjustments, meaning committing to and following through with small boundary changes builds your confidence to make harder decisions in the future. And this is where, for example, you need to decide that, am I able to do this or am I able not to do this very clearly, very early on in your day, so things become quite clear with people around you and there aren't any misunderstandings or expectations. Remember, the higher the expectation or the deeper the expectation, the higher and greater the disappointment. And this is where arguments spiral out of control. And you'll be surprised how these expectations are often silent. Number 7, practice self-compassion. If you don't follow through with your boundaries you set, instead of judging yourself, you need to respond with kindness to yourself first. Meaning, if you had a to-do list of 5 things and you managed to only do 4 things, the 5th thing needs to be moved over to tomorrow, but you do not feel guilty, angry, or resentful towards yourself, because you need to practice self-care and compassion and kindness to yourself first. Therefore, others will show you the same. Signs of healthy boundaries. These are incredibly important to think of. So when you, for example, say no without any guilt, if you're unable to do something, you need to say no, but you do not then need to feel guilty about saying no. Asking for what you want or need, taking care of yourself first. Saying yes because you want to, not out of obligation or to please others. This is incredibly important. I found during lockdown and during COVID, boundaries were just not clear. People were saying yes and no, like suddenly people were just changing and you wonder like what's going on here. It's because they were either wanting to please others or the intentions in terms of saying no were that they didn't want to sit with the guilt or they were feeling guilty for whatever reason. You need to then think about why you, for example, overcommit or undercommit, and then do you feel guilty or not? You need to behave according to your own values and beliefs. Each and every one of us during COVID-19 was tested on many levels in terms of what our values and beliefs were. I remember there was an Eid that we celebrated during a hard-ish lockdown, level 4, if I remember correctly, and there were families that still got together and had a big party and didn't really obey the lockdown rules. You need to think of your beliefs and values. And this is where, for example, if you do not feel comfortable, you do not accept that invitation to go and have lunch with that family because you don't want to expose yourself. And that's very, very important to believe. Feeling safe to express difficult emotions and have disagreements. Remember, when you set boundaries, often there will be a sense of disagreement, and there will be, for example, something difficult that you need to convey, but you need to feel comfortable sharing this because it's important. Feeling supported to pursue your own goals, and this is where having good relationships around you is incredibly important, because that's a healthy boundary that you can have. Being treated as an equal, this is often in terms of a spouse sort of relationship with each other. When we were now in hard lockdown and there was a husband and wife, for example, at home, you need to now share the responsibilities in terms of lots of different things that maybe ordinarily one person would do. Taking responsibility for your own happiness and not feeling responsible for someone else's happiness. Remember, your happiness is in your hands. You're not responsible for making other people happy. Being in tune with your own feelings. This is important in terms of what do you need and when you need it, and how can you make yourself feel better in terms of you being more productive. Knowing who you are, what you believe, and what you like. These are also important things, for example, in terms of knowing yourself, and therefore you're able to set healthy, clear boundaries and not, for example, get yourself in a really awkward situation where you think in your head, oh my gosh, how did I get here? Or why am I sitting here? I don't feel comfortable. It's because you weren't fully in tune of what you like, what you enjoy, what you believe, and you got yourself into a really, really awkward situation. This is incredibly important that I wanted to add in terms of why we people please. The reason why we people please there's numerous reasons, but I thought I'd touch on this because I find it very often, and it's a very common phenomenon that I'm seeing, especially with adults, but even children, because we do not have clear boundaries. The most clear and easiest one to think of is your desire to avoid conflict. So you just sort of people please and go with the flow. You learned it was our role in childhood. Our self-worth is tied to helping others. And this is very important to understand that the more you try to help others, but you don't have much in yourself in terms of being filled or feeling fulfilled, you can't actually help others. You like the praise that people give you. We have not figured out our boundaries. We want to help others, but we ourselves don't want to be helped. And this is where people pleasing is a vicious cycle that you generally get caught up in doing lots of things that you feel very angry and resentful about doing because you actually don't want to do it, but you like the praise. You don't have good boundaries in terms of saying no. Your self-worth is defined by helping others, and this is where it becomes very murky and blurry. And I think this is something important just to think about in terms of why often we get caught up in these situations where we don't necessarily want to be a part of or we don't fully agree with. There's different types of boundaries that you can set. There's physical boundaries, mental boundaries, emotional boundaries, and spiritual boundaries. So for example, physical boundaries, this is the actual words you can use. I love you so much and I'm in need of some physical space right now. I don't feel very uncomfortable or comfortable hugging, for example, and that's in terms of your personal space. Mental boundaries, I want to spend time with you and I cannot do that if we continue to discuss, for example, your parents, politics, or your ex, because this is an uncomfortable discussion. And this is where you set a clear boundary. I'm able to talk to you, I'm able to be there for you, but these are not subjects up for discussion because that's my boundary. Emotional boundaries, as much as I want you to be happy, I'm realizing that I can't be responsible, for example, for what you feel in terms of your happiness. Spiritual boundaries, I understand and value your spiritual practice, but talking about this makes me feel uncomfortable. So example, especially when it comes to religion, there's many people that have different beliefs or views. You then need to decide that you draw a clear boundary and you don't then step into that discussion or argument or disagreement that makes you feel very uncomfortable. I just want to touch briefly on healthy ways to relieve stress. I did think that this was the easiest area to talk on, and I know my presentation is quite long in terms of time, but I thought that, for example, slowing down, keeping calm, being positive, taking easy, unplugging, this is exceptionally important when we're so connected with so many devices all around us, enjoying life, having fun, breathing, relaxing, going outside, meditating, or praying. These are important, or some of the ways that we could, for example, ways to relieve stress. Some stress relief tips, which I do think are important, especially in the kind of pandemic that we're living in, is to take breaks from the news, eat healthy, balanced meals, avoid alcohol and drugs, make time to unwind, connect with others in a meaningful way, exercise regularly, get plenty of sleep, and take deep breaths. These are just some of the ways I thought that you could relieve stress in a healthy way, and just some ideas, but I know I touched on that very, very briefly because I just realized, and I know that my presentation is super long. And that's it from me in terms of my actual presentation.
Okay, great. I will ask you the questions that came through on the Google form. The first one was, how often should self-care take place?
I would say as often as you need. So if you, for example, think of some of the self-care tips and ideas, there are different categories of self-care. I didn't include that in the slides, but sometimes people need more self-care depending on their stress levels. And I would say that sometimes even every 5 minutes, you'd practice a little bit of self-care, taking a couple of breaths, maybe daily, maybe set aside a particular time that you do some self-care rituals. It really does vary and depend, but I would say have a mental sort of check-in with yourself, and based on that mental check-in, decide whether you need self-care more often, less often, and it does vary depending on your day and your stress levels for that particular time in your life.
Okay, sure. Someone asks, what advice do you have for someone who works in an environment where you're expected to work longer hours and it's frowned upon to actually leave work on time or as per work contract?
I think in that particular case, you need to be very clear in terms of what your work role is and what is expected in terms of your job. I do understand that because jobs at the moment and careers and people's sort of spaces in work either are becoming more complex and enmeshed, you have to have a sit down with a manager or someone to say that this is my sort of life right now. This is the kind of season I'm in. I have young kids. I need to leave work at X time, but I do feel that if I leave work at a specific time, it is frowned upon because I know that there are some careers and it is sort of something that feels prestigious that you need to work long hours in order to be deemed successful or putting in the long hours. So you have to be very clear in terms of talking to the people that you work with.
Great. Shukran. How do you manage your work life and your social life? And how do you manage when you have too much stress, when you have so much tasks with so little time slots? How do you deal with that?
You need to prioritize. I think the most important specific part of that area is if you have lots of demand in terms of work, but then also lots of demand in terms of your social expectation, maybe your family expectation, you need to then prioritize in terms of what's most important and rank it in terms of importance. I would say you then start from the most important to the least important, but also a good structure, a good routine, and good discipline will probably go a long way in ticking off a lot of things. I always find that when you have a lot of things that you are responsible for, the most difficult part is starting, but also knowing where to start. And this is where sometimes you need to either talk to someone that you trust. I have all of these things to do. Where do you think I should start? Or maybe write down a list and think of starting from the top and just working your way down without overthinking it. I like to use the analogy of, and I use this especially with kids, and it works very well. I ask them, how do you eat an elephant? Do you eat an elephant in one big chunk, or do you eat an elephant in small little bites? And when we think of what you're just describing in terms of this person's question, you need to eat the elephant one bite at a time, and the elephant will be eventually eaten. So you need to think of breaking something that seems very ginormous and big into small little chunks that are manageable in order to eat the elephant.
How do we incorporate waking up for Fajr and sleeping again into our sleep routine when Fajr becomes too early to stay up afterwards?
Yeah, so this is a really, really good question and important question. Some people are able to fall asleep easily after Fajr, especially when Fajr becomes very early. The other way that you need to think about it is, for example, the way that our sleep cycle is, and I didn't mention this, is sort of our natural biological clock is when Isha gets later because sunset gets later and Fajr gets earlier because sunrise gets earlier because of the season. Allah in His infinite mercy at that point decided that during that season, we just need less sleep. So the way that it works, in fact, is yes, maybe you do need a nap because Fajr is super early, but that shouldn't affect your waking cycle that you would still normally have. Because yes, you can have a nap after Fajr, but that's not necessarily related to your actual good quality sleep. So it's not part of your good quality sleep. That's just maybe for you to have a lie down because maybe it's super early and you do have an hour, 90 minutes or 2 hours to sleep before you need to get to work or school.
Great. Somebody asks, any other tips on how to wake up early and get into a good sleep schedule? What is the first step?
The first step is you need to get to bed early. But before you need to get to bed early, there's a lot of precursors that come in that. Is you need to be tired enough. So you therefore needed to exercise on some level during that part of that day as you want to get to bed early. I find very often, especially when I work with teenagers, if you can get your teenager to be super tired, they will sleep earlier because they are so tired, and their sleep cycle can then be adjusted slightly, even though their melatonin is released naturally a little bit later. But that means, and that has a knock-on effect, that if you sleep slightly earlier, because you are super tired and you fall asleep easier, you'll then stay asleep. If you stay asleep, you then are able to wake up at an early time. And for the first, I would say the first 10 days of trying to almost sleep train yourself, which I do very often with the teenagers that I see because they're struggling to sleep, therefore they're struggling with schoolwork, is you are exceptionally tired on day 1 up to day 10, but you wake up, you force yourself awake, you sit up, you do not lay in bed, you do not snooze your alarm, and you literally start doing something productive. The need to be needed is generally a bigger sort of anchor pulling yourself away from bed because you're not going to then lay in bed. So your purpose, or what is your purpose to get up in the morning and shower, get dressed and go somewhere? If it's work, if it's for kids, wake up, shower and go to school. And that's why I like it when kids are going back to school in person, because they then, even if they're super tired, they're forcing themselves to actually wake up, go somewhere, have purpose, feel slightly more tired, and then that has a knock-on effect in terms of sleeping earlier the following evening. As they sleep earlier that following evening or that same night, they're then able to maintain that sleep cycle. So it's a lot of discipline, and you do not then make excuses for yourself. So no, I'll just sleep for 5 more minutes. No, you wake up, you're super tired, you do something productive. That anchor or pull of needing to be needed is exceptionally important, especially for young teens and adults. And that's where you're not then going to lay in bed for another 5, 10, 15 minutes. And that's going to mess up your sleep cycle.
Related to that, somebody asks, how do you adjust the sleep cycle if you work different shifts, particularly in aviation?
Yes. So doctors, medical doctors with shift work and aviation sort of pilots, I find that you need to trick your body. So you either need to have, and I work with some people, I have worked with some people who do shift work, meaning their entire routine is sort of changed almost on a weekly level. So they're either on call at a hospital because they're medical doctors, and they then work a full 24-hour shift, and they're coming home during daylight hours. What you then need to do is trick your body, and your body is resilient and it can be tricked, where you then have blackout curtains or blackout blinds where it's completely black, meaning your room is mimicking or mimicked to look like nighttime, where it's completely dark. And you then also have these eye patches that are quite valuable. What I also find, and I don't think I mentioned this in the circadian rhythm, is there's something, I don't know the exact term, I can't remember it now, but when you put a little bit of slight pressure on your eyelids as your eyes are closed, so I'm using my fingers to just like gently press on my eyeballs, that does stimulate a little bit of, for example, melatonin and the feeling of feeling sleepy. What you often get these days is those eye patches or sleep masks that have a little bit of rice or beans or some lightweight in it. And you then put that on top of your eyes with your dark room. You're tricking yourself into mimicking the melatonin release. You then will fall asleep, but you also do get melatonin tablets over the counter. They're available at pharmacies without a prescription. And I do find that people who do shift work, especially in the aviation industry, need to then sometimes take melatonin 2 hours before they plan on sleeping in order to then get into a sleep cycle that's suitable for their line of work.
Great. Somebody asks, how do you stay motivated and not procrastinate?
Procrastination is one of my pet subjects that I love. Maybe we should organize a whole seminar on procrastination. I'm going to just go through it very, very briefly. Procrastination is a personality or is related to someone who has a particular personality type, because you're generally either a perfectionist or you like to overthink things, or you like to spend a lot of time thinking about things. What that means is procrastination is a learned habit because your personality type is something that you want to aim for perfection. You want the 90%, you want the well done from your boss, you want all of these things. What that means is you spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about things before you actually do. The first step to break a procrastination cycle is to do and think less. Meaning you literally sit at your laptop. If it's an essay that you need to type, you just start typing. Don't think about what you need to do or overthink it, just start. The first step to breaking a procrastination cycle is also to understanding, is the 90% something that is going to make you feel happier, but is the 80% good enough? And I often find, especially with teenagers that I work with, especially teenagers who procrastinate, you need to understand that is the 80% as good as the 90%, or is the 90% going to make you feel better? I also find that with procrastination, especially with type A personality types, and especially when you are perfectionistic and you are aiming and there isn't really this clear line or understanding, and you then overthink, is you generally tend to work very well under pressure, but for a long time, you do get the marks that you think you deserve. I often find that if you break your procrastination cycle, you actually get better marks because you start doing things earlier without overthinking things. The most important part about procrastinators, and this is where I really, really love the science of it, is procrastinators interpret time differently. In their brains, their sense of time, their temporal lobe, which is related for processing time, works on a different level. So research has shown that if you show a normal person who doesn't associate themselves as a procrastinator versus someone who identifies themselves as a procrastinator, a video clip of the same length, and you ask them to estimate how long the video clip was, a procrastinator will generally overestimate the time because a procrastinator thinks a 24-hour day actually has like 36 hours. So they feel like they have long, inordinate amounts of time to actually do things that normal people are like, but listen, you got one day to study. No, I got lots of time. It's lots of time. You'll hear procrastinators say this. It's a classic sense of time. They interpret time differently in their brains. And this for me is extremely fascinating and interesting because that's how they think they have lots of time and they end up working under pressure late at night at the last minute because they think they have lots of time, which is exactly where you break the cycle by just starting to do something. But maybe we should organize a seminar on procrastination. I love this.
Sure. If you're willing, we can definitely do that soon, inshallah. Somebody asks, is laying in bed and reading a book till tired okay?
It depends how long you're reading your book for, but I agree that sometimes laying in bed and reading a book is useful to get your eyes sleepy. I would say laying in bed and reading a book only if it's a Kindle where it doesn't have the blue light or it's an actual book with paper. Yes, that's okay. If you're now sitting with your phone reading something online or with an iPad, it's not going to work because the blue light is going to disrupt your sleep cycle and reduce your melatonin release, which is not going to give you good quality sleep.
Yeah, great. I'd just like to add, you get those lights that's almost like a bookmarker that you can use if like the person next to you needs to go to sleep, and then you can still switch off the lights and use that. Somebody asks, is exercise at night better than in the morning?
Interestingly enough, this is something that I'm also interested in. Generally, people either have just have a preference. So you either like to exercise in the morning or you like to exercise in the evening. There's good research to show that if you exercise in the morning, your day is more productive and you feel like it's something that you ticked off your list and it's easier to then get on with your day. If you do exercise at night, I would encourage you not to do exceptionally vigorous exercise at night because it does mess with your sleep cycle. Because of your increased heart rate, it then prohibits good release of melatonin, and the entire rhythm and cycle of what your body needs to do is a little bit out of sync. So I would say light exercise at night is better for your sleep cycle. Vigorous or moderate exercise in the morning is ideal. But I do know that generally because of work or responsibilities or drop-offs or at school or all of these things, morning exercise is not always possible. If you do need to exercise for a little bit of stress release, I would say exercise instead of not exercising, but be wary of how intense your exercise is because you might not get good sleep quality.
How do I fall asleep without the influence of sleeping tablets?
Right. So if you are dependent on sleeping tablets, and that's where you get the feeling of feeling quite foggy or woozy as you wake up, to wean yourself off sleeping tablets, you need to first ask yourself, how did you start or why did you start taking the sleeping tablets, first of all? Second of all, who prescribed it and what was the underlying reason? So it's quite complicated. If, for example, you have an underlying health issue that requires you to take a sleeping tablet because of cardiovascular disease or something that is not part of the question, so I don't really know, you then need to understand, can you then be weaned off or not? If you can be weaned off, which it sounds like the question, the person asking the question can be weaned off, you need to not just go cold turkey. So you need to go where you take, if it's one sleeping tablet, for example, in a set number of 10 milligrams, for example, you need to then start taking a lower dose sleeping tablet every day. You then take a lower dose sleeping tablet every second day. You then take a lower dose sleeping tablet every third day until you wean yourself off them completely. And a medical doctor is best to then wean you off this in a productive way. The psychology behind it is you need to teach yourself the habit and instead of depending on the chemical. So the chemical that the sleeping tablet induces, you can mimic to yourself if you practice good sleep hygiene in terms of a good circadian rhythm, but that means that you have to be very disciplined in putting all your devices away, getting to bed a certain time, making sure you're tired enough, making sure that your chronic medication of whatever sort is taken at the right time. Remember, if you're taking cardiovascular medication, antidepressants, all of these things, cholesterol medication, they affect your sleep cycle in a way that we don't fully understand. And that's where you have to talk to your medical practitioner in terms of understanding that maybe they recommended and prescribed a sleeping tablet to you, because if you don't take the sleeping tablet together with your cardiovascular medicine, you're not actually going to sleep. It's not the best quality sleep that you normally get out of a sleeping tablet. Generally, people who take sleeping tablets because of health issues always tell me that their sleep quality just doesn't feel like it's good sleep quality. They always feel foggy, blurry, their heads feel a bit clouded, their judgment seems a little bit impaired when they just wake up. And that's because you don't have a natural sleep cycle that you follow. And the natural sleep cycle that we have, I mean, I could also go on for quite a few minutes about this, is very important, where we have the REM sleep, we have the light sleep, we have the deep sleep, and all of these things contribute in a different way to what our bodies require and what it needs. And the sleeping tablet bypasses all of that, and we just sleep. So we sleep like dead sleep, which isn't good sleep, where we have the REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep, light sleep, deep sleep, and all of these things are responsible for different processes in our body. So it's a very complicated way to wean yourself off sleeping tablets, and this is where you have to speak to your medical health practitioner.
Great, shukran. Somebody asks, does being pregnant affect your sleeping cycle?
Yes, definitely. If you think of the kind of blood volume that a pregnant woman has, yes, it would affect your sleep cycle. And also, I think just having a baby in your tummy, as they get bigger and bigger, it does affect it. You need to speak to your medical doctor or gynecologist in terms of helping you understand what you would need in order to sleep best, especially while you're pregnant.
Great. Somebody says, I am a teacher. I just learned that a teen's circadian rhythm doesn't align with the time school starts. My kids have math every morning at 8 a.m. How do I get them to be alert, focused, susceptible to learning the content I have to teach them?
So it's a temporary, once they reach sort of late teenagers, I would say closer to 19, 20 years old, which is already when school is over, is the melatonin does then get released at a more normal time. But what's interesting is lots of children have learned different ways of coping when they, for example, don't feel 100% alert. Teenagers, particularly, the melatonin release and the entire sleep cycle, neurologically, their neurotransmitters, and chemically with the surge of hormones, there's just a whole host of processes that go on that are so different and complex that I do think sometimes giving them a little bit of, for example, a good breakfast where there is that spike in energy, that sometimes helps teenagers stay alert. And it's interesting how teenagers do not want to eat a good breakfast because they want to lay in bed for another 10 minutes, 15 minutes. But in fact, you need to weigh up the options. If you're going to let your teenager sleep for another 10 or 15 minutes in bed, that means they sacrifice breakfast. If they sacrifice breakfast, meaning they haven't eaten for a long time, they're not going to be as alert. If they're not going to be as alert and they're getting to school and they now have a subject like math early in the morning, well, then you can understand how much math is being learned. And this is where you need to then be very strict, set a clear boundary with your teenager and make them understand that, yes, I understand you're tired. Yes, I understand you're feeling very tired and sleepy because your sleep cycle is different to mine. But I want to help you feel a little bit more energized until your melatonin stops being released, which is closer to 9 o'clock in the morning, 9:30 in the morning. And this is where a good breakfast does help. So you need to educate your teenager, get them on board, help them understand that, yes, we know there's something different going on in your body. And that means I need to give you a good breakfast. You need to be cooperative. And this is going to help your school day.
Correct. I think the person was referring to the kids as the students, not like the actual kids. But I mean, it's the same thing. They can still educate their students on like making sure they have a good breakfast.
Yes. Remember also with teachers, sometimes educating the teens that you teach is exceptionally important in helping them understand, because a lot of teenagers don't understand that their circadian rhythm is different to everyone else, and they're getting a lot of flack from home in terms of mommy and daddy saying, listen, you're always tired. Yes, teenagers always seem tired because they just have a lot going on in their bodies and brains, which is obviously a whole host of changes that happen with puberty. And this is where they are more tired naturally. They're not just saying they're tired, they actually are more tired physically. And some of that education goes a long way in assisting in connecting and understanding teenagers better.
Yeah, Shukran. Somebody asks, how do you stop overthinking about work when trying to fall asleep?
If you have not, if you have thoughts that run, and more often than not, I have found this a very, very common thing that happens, is because either you don't have a good outlet in terms of releasing your stress, but I also find that if your thoughts are running and you find your head to be very busy and very full, so lots of people have said to me, my head feels very full or my head feels very busy, it's probably because you either have not resolved it enough, meaning you haven't put it aside, or you're one of those people that maybe don't have very clear boundaries in terms of work is work, sleep is sleep, home is home. You need to almost have like little boxes that you trick your mind into following. I would say that sometimes if it's something that's bothering you that needs to be doing or needs something to be done, I would say get out of bed, go and do whatever needs to be done, come back, have a little bit of a buffer, for example, read a book or do something else. Once you feel tired again, get back into bed and sleep. Sometimes it's the worst thing to lay there for 2 hours thinking about work when in fact you could have spent 20 minutes doing the work and then sleeping for the rest of the time. So I would say also in that case, if your brain is very busy, you probably need a bit of a healthy outlet in releasing or purging or getting catharsis in terms of why your head is so busy. So understanding the root cause of why your head is so busy and why does work constantly run in your mind.
Great. I would add maybe an outlet. Maybe you can give some examples of outlets, maybe.
Yes. So healthy outlets are, for example, maybe having a bit of a debrief with either a spouse or work colleague in terms of a day. So I find that remote working has not had that usual work banter that work colleagues would normally have. For example, oh my gosh, my manager's being so hard. He wants me to do all of this by tomorrow, but I don't have enough time to do it. And I have this and this and this and this. For example, you don't have that banter. So you don't have that outlet of sharing. Maybe arranging a work call with a colleague privately, or maybe having a one-on-one with a spouse or someone that you live with. Maybe that's a good way to release that specifically with work. I also find that maybe if you need to just make a to-do list for tomorrow, so literally saying, I need to do this, 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 and this tomorrow, and you have it down on paper or in your diary, and that can be where you empty your brain. So you need to find ways of emptying your brain so your brain doesn't feel so full, so you don't keep running through your to-do list in your head.
Okay, great. Shukran for that. That's all the questions. So to those of you online, still online listening and watching, if you have any more questions, please put them in the form in the next minute because we will be ending soon. Yeah, I just wanted to add to the outlets. I find writing really helps a lot. So I think that's something people can also do if people don't really have people that they can speak to. Yeah, writing is a good way. I think, before going to sleep, just like write everything that's on your mind is to this person that's saying about work. And then it's like, okay, it's all out on paper now, and then focus on sleeping.
Done. Yeah. So you need to find ways of just emptying your brain, and that's a good way. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a really good way.
Okay, that was all of the questions. I will just give it like 30 seconds if anyone has any questions. There was 2 people who raised their hands. If you can just rather fill it out in the form. We unfortunately aren't giving an option of people speaking. So yeah, if you can do that, otherwise we will end. So let me just check the form again and see. Somebody asks, will the slides be shared and can the recording of the session be watched on YouTube? Yes, I believe the slideshow will be shared with us, and it will be shared in the groups, in the WhatsApp groups. And yes, this Zoom session is already being streamed live on YouTube. So once it's done, and then it will still remain on YouTube, so you can always go back and watch it. Yes, and I believe you would also be able to share the recording with anybody else. Okay, so that's it for today. We'd really love to, on behalf of Muslims Connected, I sincerely thank you from the bottom of our hearts, Nabeela, for taking out the time to educate us and to share your passion and to help us. And I'm sure there'll be, I'm sure there's a lot of benefit that came out of this for all of us and our families, and you'll be rewarded for all of that. Shukran so much. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله